As I did last night, I just want to welcome a few people. Obviously, again, to reiterate our welcome of the entire Stern family who have come from near and far in order to celebrate with Lindsay. We welcome you. And again, as I did last night, our regulars who are here and who are always here on Shabbat. But then I also want to acknowledge those of you who have come maybe as an act of defiance, maybe as an act of solidarity, Jews who may ordinarily not be in Shul on Shabbat, though you should be. I just wanted to... But you're here for a reason, and I appreciate it and acknowledge it, as were many people last night. And of course, that final category, the non-Jews who reached out to us and simply wanted to be here. For those people that aren't ordinarily here on Shabbat, there's, the sad truth for you all is that was one of the longest Haftorahs of the year. Making this one of the longest services of the year. So we're going to try to speed through it a little bit, but we thank you for being here, and we thank you, of course, for your patience. This is the third time that I will address the events of the last week. I will tell you that last week, last Shabbat, as I stood here to deliver my sermon, I already knew what had happened. We had found out, Rich and I were one of the only people other than the police officers that knew what had happened. We weren't yet aware of the extent of what had happened, but as I mentioned last night, I had already given the marching orders to my daughter that she was not permitted in the hallway, that she could be in my office or next to me on the bima, and that was it. And as I explained last night, all the times that I've spoken about this, including today, last night was the most emotional and most difficult because I explained to many of you what it was like for me, not just as the rabbi of the congregation, but as a father, trying to explain this to a child that had already experienced 2 bomb evacuations in her Jewish day school, and who asked me the question whether or not any of this is real. And if it's not real, is it worth it? And I addressed that last night. I want to focus on a different aspect of what's happened over the course of the last week. And I want to begin this morning by talking about an experiment. It was an experiment that many of you may be familiar with. Some of you may have actually witnessed it in school. It was devised in the mid-19th century. It was used by overzealous high school students until the 1970s. It was used as a cautionary lesson about the dangers of gradual change. And again, some of you may have seen this in class. I did not. It was as follows. A frog placed in a cup of cool water, happy, blissfully unaware that the cup it was swimming in was being held over a Bunsen burner. And then the burner's lit, emitting a very low flame. A low flame that heated the water so slowly it was difficult to notice. And the point of the experiment, which had become a famous experiment by the time it was done in classrooms in the United States, is simple enough: to demonstrate that if the water was heated gradually enough, the frog would be unable to recognize the danger or the inevitable fate that awaited him. Throw a frog in boiling water, it leaps out immediately. Place a frog in tepid water that reaches its boiling point slowly, and the frog will do nothing to save himself. Now, the validity of the experiment, the science behind it, has been challenged. But the metaphor of the boiling frog is still widely used, and it is often invoked when an individual or a group or society fails to notice gradual changes, slowly boiled alive, not recognizing when it's too late. Now, for us Jews, the brutal irony of the Tree of Life massacre occurring 2 weeks to the day before the 80th anniversary of our boiling frog moment is too thick for us not to notice. Things were dismal for the Jews of Germany and Austria long before November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, 80th anniversary coming up. Kristallnacht, the course of which 2,000 synagogues destroyed, 2,500 Jewish citizens killed, 30,000 Jewish men arrested, sent to camps, tens of thousands of Jewish businesses plundered. It was, and excuse the play on words, it is no play on words, crystal clear that the waters of anti-Semitism had reached a boiling point. It was too late to leap from the proverbial cup of water our fate as a people was sealed, and it was unavoidable. Next week, I will tell you the true story of one of our congregants who lived through and subsequently escaped Germany after Kristallnacht. A rare occurrence. Nazi anti-Semitism was hardly a secret in 1938. By that year, Jews of the Reich had already been subjected to ever-increasing levels of degradation, humiliation, discrimination for years and years and years. Obviously, they noticed it, just as the frog must surely notice the water warming. What the frog fails to grasp in the experiment was that there's going to be some specific moment at which his ability to hop out of the cup is going to be gone. And he's going to have no choice but to meet his fate in that place. And that's exactly what the Jews who had bravely decided to weather the storm in place also failed to seize until it was too late to do otherwise. Their fates were sealed, their doom all but assured. So what was Pittsburgh? What was Pittsburgh? What happened last week? We need to carefully take the temperature of the water we find ourselves in order to determine how best to move forward. Was the massacre a horrific outlying event perpetrated by a deranged nationalist? Was the massacre more about the rise of the alt-right than anti-Semitism? Was it an emphatic message that the waters of hate have bubbled over, and given the 60% rise in hate crimes directed against Jews between 2016 and 2017, forget about 17 and 18, that statistic isn't even available to us yet, and we know it's higher, maybe we should have acted sooner to cool the warming waters around us before they reached the boiling point of last week. Maybe that's what Pittsburgh is. Or maybe it's just the beginning of the experiment. Maybe the Bunsen burner was just lit. Maybe it was just turned on and the real heat is yet to come. What exactly was Pittsburgh? Now, long before the Shoah, before pogroms, before Inquisition, before Crusades, before exile, the Talmud gave us a hint as to how to take the temperature of the waters of hate with a very strange anecdote about the very first attempted genocide of the Jewish people, which is, of course, the Purim story, the first attempted genocide of the Jewish people. And it was Haman in the story of Purim, who drafted the edict, Lahashmid, Laharog, Laabed, et kol Yehudim, min na'ar ad zaken taf v'nashim b'yom echad. Destroy, massacre, exterminate all the Jews, young and old, children and women, on a single day. And when we read the Megillah on Purim, we block out the name of this pioneer of evil and anti-Semitism with noisemakers and whistles and boos, but we give Achashverosh, who was the king of Persia, then give him a little bit of a free pass. We don't blot out his name. There's no noisemakers for Achashverosh. We don't have any terrible songs about Achashverosh. But the Talmud does not give him a free pass. Listen to this. Mashal Achashverosh v'Haman lama davar domeh. To what can we compare Achashverosh and his actions as the king of Persia and Haman, the architect of the first attempted Holocaust of the Jewish people? To what can these two men be compared? The Talmud tells us to two farmers. This is incredible. Two farmers, one of whom had a mound of dirt in the middle of his field, and the other who had a ditch in the middle of his field, and each one was suffering from his own predicament, unable to farm his field on account of this obstacle, a ditch and a mound. And the owner of the ditch, noticing the other's mound of dirt, said to himself, "Who will give me this mound of dirt? I could use it. I could fill my ditch. I'd even be willing to pay for it, a huge sum of money, in fact." The owner of the mound noticed the ditch as he was walking by his neighbor's field, and he said to himself, "Wow, I would pay for that ditch. I could take all the dirt from my field and put it in that ditch." And then at some point later on, days, weeks, who knows how far in the future, these two men met each other. You can imagine the scene. Each of them with a pint of beer. They're sitting at the bar. They're talking about their lives and how terrible they've become. They cling glasses. Oh, what's your problem? I got this horrible ditch in my field. What's your problem? Oh, I got this mound of dirt. Click. And when they see each other and meet each other, the owner of the ditch says to the owner of the mound, I'll tell you what. Why don't you sell me your mound? I'll fill the ditch. And the mound's owner, so anxious to get rid of this excess dirt, says, I'll tell you what, I'll give it to you for free. And this is how the Talmud finishes. Achashverosh himself wanted to destroy the Jews. He was thrilled when Haman had similar aspirations, and he was willing to do the job for him. Now that story, my friends, it represents a paradigm of anti-Semitism that has sadly plagued our people for 2,000 years. We indict the obvious villains, the SS guards, rounding up a town's Jews for transport. But this parable equally calls out that passive onlooker, the passive onlooker who's just as happy that someone's willing to take away that giant mound of dirt obstructing their daily lives. And that parable, it emphasizes the sense of isolation, the helplessness that generations of Jews have experienced at the hands of irrational anti-Semitism. 80 years ago, anti-Semitism came to a boil in Germany with the Night of Broken Glass, and the perpetrators were peasants and police. Peasants and police. There was no counter voice. Anti-Semitism was institutionally encouraged. It was woven into the fabric of day-to-day living. Evil, rationalized, hate and violence, cloaked in legality, raised to the level of social norm, as it had been generations and generations into the past. My friends, one of the most popular newspapers in Germany, you can see actual pictures of this newspaper at the Holocaust Memorial just over at Nova, which is the closest one, I believe, to us. One of the most popular and most widely circulated newspapers in Germany was the Der Stürmer. And every single edition of this newspaper had a tagline at the bottom of it since its inception in 1923. You want to talk about boiling water at an incremental level? 1923, this newspaper started putting a tagline as big as its headline that read, "The Jews are our misfortune." Every edition circulated to 500,000 people almost every day. For those that didn't see it, this is the front page of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you can't see it, this is the most widely circulated paper in that area, Pittsburgh. And at the top, it says, Yitgadal v'yitkadash shmei Rabbi, in Hebrew. In Hebrew. I can't help but look down at Margie Friedman. Where is she? She was just here. Where's Margie? One of our only survivors. And I can't help but wonder what she must think when she picks up a newspaper in this country that has Hebrew at its heading. And not just any Hebrew, our mourner's Kaddish. Quite the contrast between Der Stürmer. And the four names that I introduced, the Mishaberach for those who are sick with, Daniel Mead, Michael Smidga, Anthony Burke, Timothy Matson. Jews in this room, I think, were pretty well aware that these guys did not chant Haftorah when they were 13. Mead, Smigda, Burke, Matson, non-Jews. Non-Jews. 4 police officers who were still in a hospital. 4 police officers who risked their lives. 4 police officers who, in generations past, stood shoulder to shoulder with our assailants, or simply looked away as those assailants wreaked havoc in our communities. Instead, 4 police officers risked their own lives, still hospitalized with injuries sustained while trying to save Jews. In this week's Parsha, V'yikbaru oto Yitzchak v'Yishmael. We just read it. Isaac and Ishmael buried their father Abraham. We read it today on the Shabbat that breaks Shiva for 11 victims of a hate crime. we read the story of two brothers separated by conflict, separated by ideology, separated by resentment, and they push aside differences, reconcile, if even for a moment, to mourn together. Isaac, our patriarch, Ishmael, the patriarch of the Muslim world, we read that today in the Torah. Wasi Muhammad is the executive director of the Pittsburgh Islamic Center. He could not have known the Torah portion Jews read all over the world on this day, when earlier in the week in an interview, he said, on record, Jews and Muslims have similar burial traditions, and therefore we feel it our obligation to raise money to help them bury the dead. And he raised $200,000. Now, beyond the money, the imam, he pledged to offer security so Jews can pray peacefully, volunteers to grocery shop if it meant revitalizing the safety and sense of community in Squirrel Hill. Now, I can't even put my brain around this. I cannot wrap my mind around this. I still have to see this story unravel and present itself to us, because it is strange to see that type of relationship between Muslims and Jews who so often are pitted up against each other in our newspapers. Squirrel Hill is exactly like Munich. Don't get me wrong. Squirrel Hill is exactly like Munich. It's just like Warsaw. It's just like Prague. It's just like Kiev. And worse over, it's just like Babi Yar. But it's also nothing like these places. My friends, innocence is either something we lose naturally or something that's taken forcefully from us. And as Jews, we've enjoyed an innocence in this country, basking in freedoms our immigrant grandparents couldn't fathom, taking shelter under unprecedented financial, political, and most of all, social successes. And last Shabbat, that innocence was snatched from us. Our eyes were forced open and awakened to a reality that has sadly always been there. It's always been here. C.S. Lewis, he wrote, someday, an amazing quote, someday I will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. And I pray that we all live long enough to believe again in the fairy tale that anti-Semitism of the immigrant generation, that Margie Friedman's anti-Semitism belongs to her, to them alone. But for now, that fairy tale, for us American Jews, is buried, and it's buried 11 times over. November 10th, 1938, the day after Kristallnacht. I can imagine a Jewish store owner sweeping up the shards of glass that blanket his once pristine shop. Tears are flowing freely down his blackened cheeks that were battered and bruised from the boot heels that relentlessly rained down on him the night before. And former patrons, some of whom he'd once called friend, they snicker and they point with amusement as they peer from the street through the shop's broken windows. And the man continues to sweep up the glass. And his son, just a boy, angling the dustpan so as not to miss the smaller fragments his dad's collecting. And hateful taunts echo from the street. You know what those taunts are. Maybe the man feels anger. Maybe he feels shame. What is certain is that he feels alone. He feels alone. Now, the word disruptor, it's become a technical term this past decade. For those unfamiliar with it, it describes an innovation or a shift that disrupts an expected trajectory. For example, Uber, world's largest taxi company, owns no vehicles, and it has disrupted that industry. My friends, the shooting in Pittsburgh as an anti-Semitic event is not unique. It's not unique. We've seen it even in our own lifetime. It's occurred across on the shores of other countries, but it's never occurred here. As an anti-Semitic event, it's not unique. We have been the target of hate and violence and irrational irrational anti-Semitism for 2,000 years. Add Pittsburgh to the list. But it's simultaneously a disruptor of anti-Semitic events by virtue of non-Jews standing shoulder to shoulder with us. Standing shoulder to shoulder with us. My prayer as we continue forward is that we recognize that this event in Pittsburgh, each and every one of us must vow to reinforce our commitment to the Jewish people and to each other. Im ein ani li mili, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? We must acknowledge that. We must raise the walls that surround our buildings and ourselves. Security, of course, must be enhanced. We've done it here. But we must also remember the other part of that beautiful Mishnah. If I am only for myself, who will be for me? Part of our role as Jews is to not build walls high enough so that we can't see over them. I am grateful that this will be a disrupting event that has testified to the fact that non-Jews will not allow this, I pray to God, to happen again. We will take the precautions to ensure it will not happen again. But I think and I pray that for the first time, we're not alone in that effort. I want to thank those non-Jews who are here with us today for no other purpose than to show your solidarity with us. I want to thank Margie Friedman for being here today, for reminding us that this is not an isolated incident, for reminding us that Jews must protect themselves, must rely on themselves. But hopefully, Margie, as you look on, this is not Munich, this is not Poland, this is certainly not Hungary. We are partnered together with those who have committed themselves to this great democracy, and I hope that its values and tenets continue to be the foundation of all who call themselves citizens of the United States.